Fitz. Fitz, how are you? Fitz seems a little
I'm doing very well today, Ray. How are you?
Good, good. Today we welcome all the way from the UK, Dr. Nicci MacLeod and Professor Tim Grant. Dr. MacLeod is the Deputy Director of the Aston Institute of Forensic Linguistics, and Professor Tim Grant, a Forensic Linguistics instructor at Aston University as well. Both have aided law enforcement with various cases involving sex abuse conversations and victim interviews. Both Tim and Nicci also host their own podcast called Righting Wrongs, where they discuss some of their high-profile cases. Welcome to Code Red, you two.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
Is it fair to assume you're both doctors and you're both professors?
Yes, we use the honorifics in a different way in the UK than you do in the US. So that's true. We're both professors, as in teachers in a university, and we both have a PhD. My professor Tim Grant is an indication of rank in the university more than anything else.
Well, Ray, I guess you're a professor, and I'm an assistant professor. My wife Natalie is a professor emerita from Georgetown. So there's all kinds of honorifics and titles that go around. But as I always say, as long as it's correct on the paycheck, you know what I mean?
Indeed.
I've known Tim for, I think, at least 20 years, probably longer, or certainly known of him. Nicci, we've crossed paths, certainly at Aston University, which is in Birmingham, England. Nice campus. I've been there a few times, always at the Institute's invitation. And I've been very proud to be part of your, you call it a summer school, I believe, right?
That's right, yes.
For Forensic Linguistics Summer School, and it's for novice forensic linguists as well as very experienced forensic linguists to go there and present, but also learn at the same time. And so anyone out there interested in further learnings, and certainly in the UK, consider that program. But
Tim and Nicci, while Jim's frozen there, I always knew he needed to go to summer school. I always knew that. So I'm glad to see that you guys are giving him that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's only fair to point out that Jim was a instructor there when he attended, rather than a student. But we very much enjoyed his company.
You couldn't let me have just a little bit of glory there, Tim? Not even a little?
We're all learning all the time. Let's leave it there.
You can tell Ray and I go back a long way, and it's a fun thing. And I hope I'm not breaking up on a constant basis here. You're fine to me. So, Tim, we're going to get into Righting Wrongs, and I love the title, by the way. A little play on words there, alliterative at the same time, and good for you there. And I've listened to a few of the episodes, and I really enjoy the format and the cases you're presenting from, I think, over 70 years ago, as well as from a few years ago. So you really touch on some very interesting cases and some follow-up work linguists did in the UK on them. But why don't we start out? Ray's not a linguist, and many of our audience are not linguists. We're going to get into the details of Righting Wrongs in a few of the episodes and the cases. But for our audience, and I've kind of been over this before, but of course every episode has a different audience to some degree. Walk us through what is linguistics, what is forensic linguist, and both Tim and Nicci, just start us there, and maybe what the Institute does, and then we'll go a little bit into your background. So whoever wants to start.
Okay, shall I go? So by forensic linguistics, we're referring to the application of linguistic methods, linguistic theory, to specifically the forensic context. So it's a particular application. And so rather than, you might kind of think of applied linguistics as referring to the learning of English, or to classroom discourse, or to health discourse, or to communication in those particular contexts. When we refer to forensic linguistics, what we're talking about is the application to the sort of legal or kind of investigative context. So anywhere where there is a question or a problem that is based in language that is at its heart linguistic, that would be somewhere where forensic linguists would become involved. So we're always sort of doing that with a view to somehow improving the delivery of justice. So whether that's to do with kind of improving linguistic processes within the system, so things like police interviews, cross-examination, emergency calls, or whether we're actually talking about a particular case where there's a linguistic problem. So, for example, an anonymous letter or an anonymous text message, or some question around what a particular word or phrase meant in a particular context, then those are the sort of kinds of cases where a forensic linguist might be called upon to sort of provide their opinion and provide their expertise.
Yeah. If I can just sort of add to that a little, I think it's quite interesting. So in the UK and across Europe and some other parts of the world, I think we work with a broader definition of forensic linguists than you guys do in the US. So we take in the area under the sort of umbrella of forensic linguistics. We take in areas of language and law. So I know that colleagues who work as forensic linguists in the US, they tend to use the term only in what we would call investigative forensic linguistics. So this is, helping investigations or ultimately taking evidence to courtrooms. So, but I think our slogan about using language analysis to improve the delivery of justice, we see it more broadly. We see it as Nicci has said, and Nicci's expertise is in improving police interviews of rape and sexual assault victims. Yeah, so that in our domain comes under forensic linguistics, which I don't think you'd count that as forensic linguistics in the US because it's not directly been involved in investigation. But so we have this broader take, maybe some American forensic linguists do also have that broader take, but yeah. So the area reaches into the investigative end of things, and that's tended to be my speciality over the years. Assisting in providing evidence for criminal or civil cases, and both for defense and prosecution. We try not to be for one side or the other. We try to see where the evidence leads.
When you're talking about linguistics or forensic linguistics, is that applicable to both the written and spoken word, or is there a difference?
So I work mostly with textual data. As forensic linguists, we would listen to tapes, and there's an episode in this series where Nicci works with some taped data, covert tape from the back of a police van. But the problem there is a transcription problem. So what we don't get involved in is what's sometimes called forensic speech science or voice comparison work. That's another technical area. So when we're listening to tapes, it's to understand the language and the meanings on those tapes more often than anything else. And we wouldn't get into that technical audio comparison work. That's a different discipline, at least in the UK. I know in some jurisdictions, like in Germany, the two things are more closely interlinked.
And there are linguists, I believe, is it David French? In the UK that do the phonetic and phonological work, and they have entire laboratories devoted to that, correct?
That's right, yes. Yeah. So Peter French Associates is one
Peter
of
French.
the better known forensic speech science labs in the UK, but there are others as well.
Sure. And I've had people in the US ask me for, who's the best at the speech analysis, and I would usually give them Peter's name and his laboratory. Yeah, so I still want to get into your stories a little bit in terms of how you got where you did, but forensic linguistics was trial by fire for me back in 95 and 96 with the Unabomb case. And since I was an employee of the FBI, mine was always the work I did, eventually getting my graduate degree at Georgetown in linguistics, but mine was investigative based because I was working for the FBI. And I didn't work for the defense then in any cases, but I have since in my now 17 years of retirement, hard to believe, semi-retirement. So, and I think one thing I'd like to stress out there, if you're going to be taken serious as an expert in any field, you really do have to work. I won't even say both sides, all sides. If there's even something, the courts could be kind of a neutral in the middle client, so to speak. and you could have law enforcement, and you also could have defense attorneys. And I think I learned a lot working in a criminal defense matter years ago, which it's coming out of my fourth book, a chapter on that, the bizarre outcome of it. But yeah, and we were at the Linguistics Society of America conference in Philadelphia in January, and there was a talk there about advocacy and expertise. And I didn't get a chance to go. The schedule just didn't work out. But to me, there's sort of, you can be an advocate expert, but I think to be taken serious in the courts, that's a slippery slope to find yourself in. And I certainly in the U.S. courts, if you're seen as only working for one side, only the police, only the defense, it could be problematic. Nicci, Tim, I've heard your podcast. I kind of know where you're coming from here, but just for our audience's sake.
Yeah, so I guess the thing to keep in mind is that as an expert, your only duty is to the court, and it's to help the court reach the decision or to equip them with all the evidence that they need to make that decision. So yeah, we talk about this in the podcast, that it's not really our role to tell the jury what decision to make. It's our role to assist them to reach a decision. So for example, in a case of questioned authorship, we might talk about how the style of the questioned text, be that a blackmail letter or a threatening letter or whatever it might be, or a text message, we might conclude that the style of that text is more consistent with the defendant than anybody else, but it's not for us to say the defendant wrote this text. That's not a conclusion that we would ever reach. That's something that is very much for the jury to reach. And yet we would work for both sides. We wouldn't want to sort of be seen as a hired gun that's going to kind of produce something or come to a conclusion that's going to support the side that instructed us, because it's very much for us to go in with an open mind and to present something that's actually going to be fair and rooted in science and helpful for the jury.
Yeah, and I think we have, we certainly have a very strong duty placed upon us by the courts and the legal system in the UK on that neutrality. So there's actually a sort of quasi-governmental office of a forensic regulator who sets out rules for expert witnesses across disciplines. And that says very strongly, and you have to sign off every report with a statement saying that you agree that your overwhelming duties to the court, not the party that paid you. And you can, and indeed there have been cases where expert witnesses are found in contempt of court if they've egregiously broken that declaration. So there was a case in the UK. It was a medical expert witness who was basically shilling for his clients against the insurance companies to get bigger and bigger payouts, and he was prosecuted under that a breach of that declaration. So there's a sort of enforceability beyond the normal adversarial process to sort of keep you honest as an expert, certainly in the UK system, which I think is a good thing. But it slightly breaks down the idea of an adversarial courtroom, where the traditional view, if you like, and which was the case in the UK until a decade or two ago, is that it's up to the other side to point out the flaws in your argument. You make the best case you can. That's largely gone in UK expert witness work now.
Yeah. And as well as the forensic science regulator, we've got sort of statutory instruments, so the criminal practice directions, the civil practice directions, and these both contain a sort of a template, like Tim was talking about, that you need to include in your report to attest to the fact that you've only given opinions within your sphere of expertise, that if there's a range of opinions and you've fallen down on a particular one, you need to explain why, and you need to, particularly if you're working for the prosecution, any material that you haven't relied upon in your report, you need to include as an appendix. So there are quite sort of strict guidelines around what you need to include there.
And the other fun sort of interaction you can have. So in the jargon of the barristers and the courts and the expert witnesses, this is known as hot tubbing. So a judge can order two opposing experts to get together and produce a joint report which sets out their points of agreement and disagreement. The judge will say, he or she will say, I don't want to hear this in my court. You two go away, take, a month or whatever it is, get your heads together and write a joint expert report. And that's what the court will hear. And you're allowed in that report to point out where you disagree. But the idea is to find all the areas of agreement. And more often than not, as an outcome of that process, then the adversarial side falls away. So I've been involved in hot tubbing just on a couple of occasions. I think you have at least once, Nicci. Is that right?
I have. Yeah, I was newly qualified, just a few months out of my PhD, and my first ever court appearance. And when I arrived, and I was working for the prosecution, and when I arrived, the police officer said, "Oh, the defence have instructed their own expert, and the judge would like you to sit down in a room together and talk about." Points of agreement and disagreement. So that seemed quite nerve-wracking. And then when I walked into the room, the opposing expert was the person who'd examined my PhD about 4 months previously, so, Alison May. So it was even more daunting than I first thought it would be. But yeah, it was fine, and it was just a case of obviously to save court time and public money and so on. It was a case of kind of summarising where we both came down and where there were quite a lot of points of agreement and kind of putting that to the judge.
Well, I'll just add to that. As both Nicci and Tim know, forensic linguistic worldwide, we're kind of a small group. There's several hundred of us, give or take, and some practice, some don't. Some just study, and that's all good. But there are some strong personalities contained therein, and I can only imagine being forced to hot tub with a few of them out there. But in an actual hot tub or actually in a legal hot tub, I would want to avoid all those. But we don't have that equivalent here. You probably heard of the Daubert ruling, or Daubert, it's pronounced, the French term. We're not getting into all the, but in each case, an expert basically has to reprove him or herself in front of the courts through a voir dire system, Q&A, and experience. You don't have to have a terminal degree. You don't have to have any degree to be an expert in the courts of New York, just some demonstrated knowledge and experience of the subject matter to which you're referring. I also have my students, I always mention to my students to watch the movie My Cousin Vinny. And at the end, his girlfriend gets up and testifies about tire treads or the makes of certain cars from 1960s, whatever, because she worked in the garage, her father, and she knew this stuff. So she was a qualified expert in the courts of New York with her, deep, Brooklyn accent, whatever. So I'm not sure the equivalent to that in the UK. Can someone be an expert in that sort of realm of knowledge without an advanced degree? I don't know.
So there's the traditional criteria is having the qualifications and the experience to provide knowledge above that would be presumed within the jury. There's that sort of traditional category. But then with the recent reforms to what we call the criminal practice directions, which are about admissibility and so on, there's increasing regulation of who can and cannot become an expert in the UK courts. And so labs certainly have to have various certifications done and are recognized under various criteria that the regulator puts out and so on and so forth. It's not quite reached linguistics yet, because as you say, linguistics is a pretty small discipline, and we don't tend to work in labs. And so like I say, it's not quite reached forensic linguistics, but the principles have. And the principles about using validated methods and the lack of bias that we've already talked about, and something about the expression of results also. So all of those things we have to abide by, even though we're too small perhaps to feel the full force of regulation as if we were a large lab.
Ray, anything here? I'm not sure you've testified as an expert. I think you have in something, right?
Who, me?
Yeah.
You're asking me? Well, I just want to throw this out for our audience, for audience purposes. I know when you hear it, and I'm going back to my knowledge of forensic linguistics. Other than Jim, I really never heard of it, other than it came to the Unabomb case. So most of our audience is in the same realm as I am. So they sit there and they say, well, I've heard of linguistics, traditional linguistics, but then there's forensic linguistics. What is the difference, if there is a difference? And what are the main linguistic techniques that you use in forensic linguistics?
Okay, so linguistics is about language description mostly, and explanation about how language works. In terms of language description, we can describe the words people use, the grammar, or in other words, the way people put words together. So we'd refer to that as the syntax. You can also describe how people do things with the words they use, and that's what we call pragmatics, and it's a form of meaning, which is semantics. Yeah. And then you build up to larger and larger systems of language. So we talk about discourse structures, which is bigger than the sentence or in a document, and then sociolinguistics, which is how communities use language. So all of that is the sort of, and more, is part of the academic discipline of linguistics itself. So I think of linguistics as the sort of the rigorous, or if you like, the scientific description of language and how language works. None of that is to do with court cases or investigations or blackmails or murders or whatever else. And you can use that linguistic knowledge and apply it in the different ways that Nicci was saying. So you can apply it to how doctors talk to their patients or how classroom interactions work. So for forensic linguistics, that area of application is, for us, the sort of the area of improving justice. And quite often that's in the courtroom. So I understand the principles of describing language in terms of word selection and syntax, and that might help me characterize Jim's writing style. Yeah, and in forensic linguistics, I might use that to show that Jim did or did not, or was not a likely writer of a particular text. If I could show his style was distinctive enough using those areas of language description, then that would give me a way of providing some evidence towards that conclusion of the likelihood of him becoming a writer. If you're talking about sort of meaning and pragmatics, the questions might be a bit different. I had a great case once where I was asked to write the phrase. So you've got to imagine the situation. You've got a businessman doing business in the middle of London high finance, when there are an awful lot of Russians involved and a lot of talk of organized crime and so on. And this Russian businessman said to another person, I can make good things happen to you. And the person heard that as a threat. Yeah. So my job as a linguist for the court was to explain how that could be heard as a threat and whether it would count as a threat under the law. So I can cause good things to happen to you. If you can cause good things, you can cause bad things. And in terms of pragmatics, causes are usually associated with bad things like famines and earthquakes and recessions and things like that. So that's why the person heard it as bad things. Yeah. So that's an entirely different area of description of linguistics. Yeah. Pragmatics, which can answer a different sort of question, which nevertheless could be helpful in the court.
You know, I sit and I listen to what you're saying, and I find it fascinating. I really do.
Right.
I find it fascinating, and I know our listeners do too. And I sit and I go, really? Now, then I'm a realist, and I go, you know, how does the court treat this when you come to the court?
It wasn't convinced by I wrote a beautiful report. I was entirely convinced that that this was indeed a threat, and I set out all the reasons why, and the court didn't believe me. But I'd done my job. Yeah.
Yeah,
so you're right. That's beyond us. Is it convincing enough to those courtroom standards? We've got to do as good a job as we can, but it's not always the case that we succeed.
Yeah,
well, you know, Tim,
variation.
you go in, Tim, and you give this one presentation, and then Nicci comes in and says, you know what? I disagree with Tim. I think it's this. Does that happen, Nicci?
Well, not with Tim. We have gone up against each other, thank goodness. But yeah, that's always a possibility that the opposing expert is going to stand up, and then it's. I mean, I've written about this actually. I wrote an article called Art versus Craft, because there's, up until very very recently, there was a very kind of laissez-faire, lax approach to what counted as expertise, and that there's not necessarily, there quite often are requirements around qualifications, but then also someone's kind of professional experience might count as enough sort of basis for them to go and provide their expertise. And so one of the kind of issues is that we've already, by admitting expert testimony, we're already saying that these are things that are outside what we can reasonably expect a jury to understand. So we've kind of ticked that box. But then if they're then presented with two opposing opinions on the same kind of matter in question, the question arises: how can we possibly expect them to make the decision of which to sort of which opinion to go with? If we've already acknowledged that this is outside their understanding, or what we can reasonably expect them to understand. So to then sort of put, present them with two opposing opinions on the same matter, it's quite tricky really to sort of resolve that. And like I mentioned at the start, we're there to help them, but that's the case for both experts who are going in with apparently completely different.
And I think this is right. This is where the job is. I think the most effective expert in the courtroom is the person who best provides the information to show the jury that they can make their own decision. So there's a lovely and sadly deceased forensic linguist and lawyer, Larry Solon, who said the role of the linguist in the courtroom is to be a tour guide for the jury. Now, he was talking in a slightly different context, right? But that's the idea. If you can show the jurors how they can come to their own conclusions, then that's much more effective than standing up and telling them what your decision is. Yes, because you give them the evidence to reach those conclusions and assume that they're, smart enough to make use of that evidence. Then that's much more effective than me standing up and saying, I'm a professor of forensic linguistics. Believe me, this guy wrote it. I'll never do that. And I don't think it's an effective strategy either.
Yeah, and the expression in the U.S. and probably worldwide, if a jury trial is in fact part of the legal system, is the expert's role is to educate the triers of the facts, and just that's the best you can do. It's not lecturing to them. It's looking at them, explaining to the best you can. Whatever the science is. In fact, I learned in your I think the third podcast that there is such a thing as a forensic meteorologist.
Indeed.
And we're not going to get into that now. That's a whole other podcast. But actually, when there's a Weather Channel is popular here in the U.S., and they actually hired me to come on and talk about a case. They're doing the Weather Channel is now doing true crime, and I discussed the case of some people who were tracked down with snow prints. And so maybe for that one episode, besides being a forensic linguist, I was at least a part-time forensic meteorologist. So we skipped over what we'd like to always begin our podcast, and I know our audience likes this. And Tim, you're first on my screen. Give us like a minute or so. What's your life journey that brought you into the Cold Red podcast today, but certainly the Writing Wrong podcast? Okay. And take as long as you want.
Okay. So my academic journey isn't entirely from within linguistics. I started, my first degree was a philosophy degree. And in philosophy, I got interested in the philosophy of language, and I got interested in the philosophy of mind. And then I took as a master's degree something which still exists, but is sort of being overwhelmed by other interests, which is called cognitive science, which back in the 1990s, which ages me a little, was about, can we get computers to use language? Can we get computers to think? It's sort of the early days of artificial intelligence. And so I was studying that and learning how to write computer software to analyze language and hopefully produce language in, how many decades is it? 5 decades before large language models were produced. Is that no? 3 or 4. Anyway, I can't count, but I can do linguistics. I attended a talk by someone known well to all the linguists in this podcast, by Malcolm Coulthard. And he was a professor of linguistics at Birmingham University, the University of Birmingham in the city of Birmingham. So Aston University is a different university in the city of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. And Malcolm was getting involved in criminal cases, mostly appeal court cases. Some of them are really big and famous cases in the UK. So we've mentioned the Derek Bentley appeal. He was an early linguist in that. He was involved in analyses around the Birmingham pub bombings, which you might have heard of in the US, and various other big appeal court cases. And he presented on a method that the Reverend Andrew Morton had been using in the courts called the Kusum method for analyzing text. Now, Andrew Morton was a biblical scholar, and he was interested in authorship analysis of the books of the Bible. So could you show stylistically that the author of John's Gospel also wrote the books of Revelation, and so on? There's lots of different authorship questions in the biblical world. And he was investigating that, and he came up with a method that he was then taking into the courts. And almost always what he showed was that a confession witness statement was not in the language of the individual, but had been doctored and written by the police officer. And anyway, so Malcolm gave this talk to this group of cognitive science master's students and said, the Reverend Andrew Morton has this method, and I see no linguistic reason why it should be working. Does someone want to take that on as their master's dissertation, their master's thesis project? We had to do a research project. And I thought it was fascinating. Yeah. So I stuck my hand up to that task, and he took me on as for my master's dissertation. And I wrote some software and I did some analyses, and I showed that indeed it didn't work. And at the same time, lots of way more qualified people than me were also showing that this system doesn't work at all, and it shouldn't be used in the courts and so on. So that was just a master's thesis. It didn't get published. It didn't go any further. But at the end of the process, Malcolm turned to me and said, well, can you do any better? Can I make a system for authorship analysis that could work? And that was the beginning of my PhD journey. So my PhD, some years later, too many years later, ended up in being titled Authorship Analysis in a Forensic Context. But back in the day, there weren't forensic linguists in universities under those names. So I worked in a department of communication studies, a department of speech and language therapy. I wound up in a department of forensic psychology at Leicester University. And Malcolm wrote to me saying he had an opportunity to form at least a research grouping of forensic linguists at Aston University. And that's how forensic linguistics started at Aston University. Myself, my colleague Christoph Credens, and Malcolm Coulthard, a group of three of us, set up the Centre for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University in 2008. And then Nicci came and left. Nicci can tell her own story amongst a group of others. And we grew slowly over time. And then in 2019, we won a big UK government grant, which was for capacity building. So the British government effectively said, this is an area of expertise that we want to invest in. And at that point, they gave us about £6 million over 3 years to say, build a research institute, make it bigger, make it better. And that's what we've been doing since 2019. And we're now a group of about 25 or 30 forensic linguists dedicated within the institute. That includes sort of faculty staff, researchers, PhD students. And we believe that makes us the biggest grouping of forensic linguists in the world. And we'd like to think we're pretty good at it too. It's not just a matter of size. And it gives us that sort of that capacity, that power to win more money, to be sustainable, but also to do the various diverse things we've talked about.
I want to hear from Nicci, but just you're so good, Tim, that you were hired on a grant in the US over the last few years to work on AI and AI explanations and things like that. So
that's right.
Your reputation is obviously international.
Yes, thank you. Yes, it was an IARPA funded program. And there were a few, Christoph and I and a couple of other Brits were on it, but I don't think many overseas people. It's mostly Americans.
And lastly, you mentioned Malcolm Coulthard. I'm not sure what title you want to give him, but to me, he's the grandfather of forensic linguistics, certainly in the UK. Whether he likes that or not, he's a gentleman. He's a scholar. He's a very personable individual. I know he's retired now, but I know you're still in touch with him, and he's been very influential in my career.
He's an emeritus professor at our university still, and he's very involved, and he's running the summer school this summer, or being involved in the summer school this summer. And he chairs our advisory board, so he's never quite fully retired. And in the same way as you, Fitz, I'm pretty sure that he'll be keeping going to the end in one way or the other.
I suppose in the U.S., Roger Shy is considered sort of the grandfather of or godfather, depending on how you want to look at it, of forensic linguistics. But of course, there's other people that contributed before that. But Nicci, let's hear from you. You're maybe, instead of going back 5 decades to the 90s, like Tim said,
Well, I will
he knows his language. That's for sure.
Yeah. I will actually have to go back quite a long time, because I first decided I wanted to be a forensic linguist when I was about 13. So I was watching a police drama, and on this particular police drama, there'd been a murder, and there was a body that had been discovered, and there was an emergency call that was placed to report this dead body. And the police were quite convinced that the person that had made the phone call to report having found the body was in fact the murderer. And so they called in, they had this recording of the phone call, and they called in someone who I now know to be a forensic dialectologist. I obviously didn't know at the time that there was a name for what this person was doing. But he came in and listened to the recording, and some listeners might not remember, but back in the day before PowerPoint, we used to use overhead. We used to use transparencies and sort of project them onto the wall, and that's what this person did. He said, "Well, listen to the recording very carefully." And he said, "This speaker has got this particular feature in their accent, and that's only used in this area." And he drew a little circle on the overhead transparency, and then he listened a bit more and said, "And he's also got this feature in his accent," and he drew another circle, and where these two circles overlapped on the map was just one village, and this allowed the police to go to that village and I basically identify their suspect, the person that had made this phone call. And I was absolutely I was on the edge of my seat and absolutely hooked on this. I thought, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do for when I grow up. I'm going to be like that person. And so sort of fast forward a couple of years later, I was sitting my German GCSE. So GCSE is the equivalent of what you do at the end of high school before you kind of go off to study further. And as part of my German speaking exam, I had to talk about what I wanted to be when I grew up. And I said to the German teacher, "Well, what's the German for forensic linguist?" And she said, "I don't even know what that is in English. Just say that you want to be a solicitor." This is obviously this was on the list in the vocabulary book. So she said so. So I know what solicitor is in German. It's Rechtsanwalt, and if anyone's interested, because I'm never going to forget that, because that's what I had to say in my speaking exam, despite having no desire to be a solicitor at all. So that was the very beginnings of me deciding this is what I wanted to do. And so I selected A-levels based. So that's the next stage of education in the UK. Based on doing that, I did very well I'd always been good with languages anyway, but I did very well with English language, went on to do a degree in English language. And in the final year of that degree, there was an optional module in forensic linguistics. So I did that. And then I went on to do a master's at Cardiff University in forensic linguistics, and I was quite sort of set on continuing my kind of academic career and going on to do a PhD. And I saw Tim speak at an event in a country house in the middle of Wales about some work he'd been doing with his colleague Jess Woodhams about linking sexual offences based on the language that was used by the perpetrator, and how it was quite useful to sort of do a pragmatic analysis of what the perpetrator had said sort of prior to and during and after the attack. And this was a a fairly reliable method for linking cases. And so that kind of set me on the track of thinking this is, you know, I read further and further into the way that sexual offences are treated by the legal system, and I kind of finally landed upon the topic that I wanted to sort of pursue further at PhD, which was the way that the police interview victims of rape and serious sexual assault, and the ways in which potentially this kind of ingrained mythology that exists around sexual violence, so the things that people think about victims and about why it happens, and you know, kind of explanations around that and what sort of people do it. And there's you know, there's a quite kind of set you know, a very well established set of kind of myths that go along with how people sort of perceive those, and that, you know, the legal system isn't immune to that. They exist in the amongst the general public, but they also exist within the legal system, within the courts, within the police. And I wanted to see whether there was any kind of evidence of that sort of seeping through to the way that victims were questioned, and whether there was anything that a linguistic analysis of those interactions could offer in terms of improving the whole process for victims who, you know, it's obviously an incredibly traumatic experience for them to sort of have to relive. We know everything about how dreadful cross-examination can be for victims, for example, but quite often the police interview, that kind of reliving of the experience can also be quite a uncomfortable experience for victims. And so I wanted to see if there's anything that we could do to alleviate that and to sort of improve the process. So that's what I started to do my PhD at a different university, and then a bursary was advertised to come to Aston. And this was Malcolm Coulthard that told me about it. I'd met him a couple of times, so I applied to come to Aston to take up that bursary, and I was successful. And so I came to Aston in 2006. So I was actually here before Tim and before the Centre for Forensic Linguistics was actually set up, because Malcolm was here and had I think rooted for me quite strongly at that stage of sort of applying to do a PhD. So and then obviously Tim joined and the centre was set up, and I kind of worked with Tim on a few different projects as a postdoctoral researcher. I went away for 3 years, and then the mothership called me back 3 years ago. And so 2022, I returned to Aston, and then last year took on the role of deputy director of the institute. And so that's kind of how I got to where I am now. And I've just been successful in securing money to look in going back to my PhD topic. I'm still kind of pursuing this, still trying to sort of improve the process for they call them ABE interviews. The Achieving Best Evidence is a sort of protocol that they follow, and that's kind of where I'm still on that topic. I'm still sort of a bit like a sort of a dog with a bone in terms of wanting to make that a better experience for all involved, really.
Ray, why don't you take this to them? I want to hear a good case out of them before we go too much longer, but you go.
You know, would it be better for you to discuss a case individually or something that you work together?
We've not really worked. We've only accidentally worked different sides of the same case, but Nicci couldn't remember that one. So maybe individually.
Well, how about we start with you, Tim? And you know, and you probably have a longer history, but there's always that one case that no matter what you do is always going to stick with you. What case would that be for you?
So I guess there's different kinds of sticking with, in the sense that the case that sprung to mind when you asked that question was the case that perhaps disturbed me the most, was a case involving an online abuser of vulnerable adults and children. And he was identified and arrested and is now serving a long term in the UK. A guy called Matthew Falder, who made use of the sort of the powers of the online world to identify and extort people to do things that they would have never otherwise done, and recorded them, and so on and so forth. And our task on that case was we had his encrypted writings on the dark web. He was a member of a dark web paedophile forum, and also encrypted emails back and forth with the victims. And we started off in that case trying to write a profile of him. Well, Christoph helped a little bit initially, and also Jack Grieve, who was a colleague at Aston and is now at the University of Birmingham. And in the end, Jack and I wrote profile, and also we started an attempt to what we started to call author search. So the idea of a linguistic profile, we were able to identify that although he used a lot of Americanisms, he was almost certainly a native speaker of British English. So we were looking for a Brit. It was really interesting whether the Americanisms were because he was sort of naturalized in the internet or not, or whether, because a lot of English on the internet is American English. It's heavily flavored by American English. But he used, for example, the term washing up liquid, which is a British English term, and dish soap, an American English term, within 20 words of one another. Yeah. So it wasn't a clear-cut case from a casual reading, but by the time you got into it, it was clear that he was a Brit. And we were able to provide a profile, and we said that he was professional and very well educated. We thought he was older. That was the one thing we got wrong. And we said that he was either in the financial industry or had a lot of family money. He was, some of the terms, some of the metaphors he was using were in that direction. And so that was the profile. We did a profiling stage, and then we did a stage which we came to call author search, where we started taking phrases which were quite distinctive from these encrypted conversations and searching the open internet for him. Could we find him on the open internet? And there's a really interesting case out of Australia where this technique was successful. Yeah, so they had it again. It was a case of a paedophile who opened all his conversation with Hyas, H-I-Y-A-S, like a variant of hi or hi-use or something like that. And it was seen as really distinctive. And the Australian police officer found an individual using that, and I think it was in a classic car forum online. And then other things started to line up, and they'd found their guys. We tried to do this author search thing, and we failed with this guy. After the arrest, it wasn't necessary to use it in court, but I also did a little bit of comparative authorship analysis where they had known documents written by him, and they were compared with the online sexual discussions and so on.
If I can ask you this, Tim, you have a person here that's intentionally trying to disguise his writing and his speech patterns. What, number one, and I know our audience, I want to know, but I know our audience wants to know, how did you determine that? And then what did you do to be, and I know you're telling us what you did, but what was your technique in ordering to actually zone in on this guy?
Sure. So we were part of a massive investigation teams across the US, Australia. Many police forces were involved. It was a really big case worldwide of people trying to track him down. So we had we were a very small part of the bigger investigation. Lots and lots of people with different discipline backgrounds from computer forensics and other things were involved, sort of feeding into the decision makers, the senior investigating officers in charge of this case. So I don't want to overstate our contribution. And in fact, our author search attempts were completely failed. And it turned out after his arrest, this is because he had almost no presence on the internet except for his offending. So he didn't have a clear web blog or comments on newspapers or all those things. His only existence online was in the encrypted space. He was very good at the operational security and so on. So we did the task, and we did okay at the task. I'm not sure how much the linguistics contributed to his arrest in the end. But to get to your question on the disguise, I was never, so you look for contradictions, right? And I was never quite sure whether this example of dish soap and washing up liquid was an attempt at language disguise. Was he trying to pass himself off as an American English speaker or not? You know, it was a question that we asked ourselves and tried to establish ways of answering, but it was never clear to me whether that was the case. We've done work. Nicci and I have done work on language disguise. We had a program where we were training online undercover police officers, mostly in operations against paedophiles online, about how they could assume the identity of, say, a 14-year-old girl or something like that, and what were the tells. And there were other taskings they had as well, but that's the sort of the caricature tasking. And we know there's TV shows and whatever, perverted justice and To Catch a Predator and this kind of thing. And but if you're put yourself in the shoes of a paedophile looking to meet up with a child, that's a really high risk thing to do. Yeah, because the presumption is maybe it's an undercover cop on the other end. So what are the tells? What are the things that scare away the paedophiles? And you've got to get the low-level language right if you're going to do language disguise. Yeah, you've got to get the vocabulary right. You've got to get the syntax stuff right. But that's moderately easy to get right. You can train the undercover police to get that right nearly all the time. But the next layer up, the pragmatics that we were talking about earlier, it's far harder to fake. Yeah. So if you think of this context, you get things around topic control. Who introduces the sexual topics? Yeah. If you're a child, which topics do you turn down or don't pick up as topics for conversation? Yeah. The patterns at that level of topic introductions and topic denials are much harder for the average person to notice, the non-linguist to notice. And so so if you think someone's engaging in language disguise, it's those levels of language description where you can probably catch them out. And if you get a contradiction between the sort of the low-level word selection and that higher level pragmatic analysis, I'd say believe the pragmatics over the word selection, because I might notice the words you use. I'm not going to notice those patterns of topic introductions. But for the Matthew Boulder case, we wrote our profile. They found him through other means, and I'll probably never know how. Yeah, and arrested him, and our profile proved correct. But it's a case that haunts me still, just because of the nastiness of the data. And you have to get your head wholly into this material, and it sticks with you. It takes a toll a little.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If I can summarize, I think what Tim said, and I learned a long time ago, and I actually include this in my reports and sometimes when testifying. And basically, it's I don't think you'll disagree with this, Tim or Nicci, but lifelong language and stylistic features in we'll say writing are much more difficult to suppress than the purposeful insertion of elements of disguise. Yeah. And as I'm sure both of you know, someone can be really clever on page 1 of the document they're writing, purposely misspelling things or ungrammatical, non-standard, but by page 2 they forget the persona they adapted on page 1. And this could be in one document, or it could be a series of documents, 10, 12, and the 12th document has the spelling that's standard as opposed to the number 2 document when not. So it's many times you have to be very, very careful if you're going to insert disguise and keep it, consistent throughout. And like it's famous with the Ramsey case, the John Benet Ramsey case, which I pointed out early on, and we don't discuss who killed the girl at this point for legal reasons, but in the first few lines, possession is misspelled with 1 S and business is misspelled with 2 S's. And I opined early on that it's they basically have the Z sound, and if you're going to get one wrong, you're going to get the other one right, be it business or possession. And that's when I knew early on that, there was disguise employed, at least in the first page, the first few lines. So you have to be a little more clever, a little smarter than that. Now, if you only have 10 words or 20 words, maybe you can get away with something. But you get into 10 or 20 pages or 10 or 20 separate documents, that's when these features that, Ray, are lifelong in all of this. And good time, Tim or Nicci, to define idiolect and what that means. I think that ties in here also. But I'll let you add to what I just said, and then we get to Nicci's case.
I made Nicci define idiolect in one of our podcasts, so it feels like it's only fair.
Well, I heard it.
But just to pick up on what you've said there, and we'll define idiolect along the way. One of the things Nicci wrote about in the book we wrote on this work with the undercover cops is this problem of identity leakage. So what we're talking about is the police officer will have their own language style, their lifelong language style that you've been talking about, Jim, and then that will leak into the identity they're trying to assume. Yeah, so they might have got the chat logs that have occurred before they were brought in between, say, this girl and this offender. Yeah, they've studied those to try and assume that girl's identity online, to arrange a meetup with the offender so that they can be arrested. Yeah, and what you find is you get what we refer to as a hybrid identity, somewhere halfway between the girl's language style and the police officers. And this is because this lifelong language style, that they're different, but they come together in this identity assumption case. And it's a form of language disguise. It's not the only form but if you're trying to be someone specific, that's a really hard task. And this is where we come to the idea of idiolect. So an idiolect is your own personal language style. And it's there's arguments that it's partly cognitive, that your brain has formed into different patterns. It's certainly social, but what stays the same when the situation changes? We've got a whole set of sort of I was going to say pure research projects. So they're on idiolect at the Aston Institute. So our colleague Christoph Cradens is really intrigued by the idea of idiolect. So there's a TV show in the UK that follows a set of people from the age of 7 and picks them up every 7 years, and they're now 67. So I think the next one will be they're 73 or 74 or something like that. Bad maths again. It picks them up every 7 years, and what Christoph has shown in that study is how aspects of the language that they used when they were 14 or 20 or in their 20s exist now in their 60s. So this lifelong language style is real. And Christoph is also examining what stays the same when you move between genres. So between the certain genre of, say, writing a student essay to writing an email. And maybe he has some spoken picture tasks. So he's got this corpus, this database of language, which he calls the 100 Idiolects Project, where he has, I think now, 112 people, all producing language across seven different discourse types to see what is the same across the discourse types, because this is known to confound authorship analysis tasks and so on. So the idiolect is about what stays the same across genres or discourse types, maybe across a period of time. It doesn't have to be your whole lifetime. I write about stability of idiolect, which means it may change slowly rather than fast. It's not static necessarily. So I wouldn't be very comfortable comparing the language of a 14-year-old with someone who's now 67 or whatever it might be, because of all that change that might have occurred in between. But that's the idea of an idiolect, I think. It is what's you individually. I think it doesn't have to include the idea of distinctiveness. Okay, some people sort of would wrap up distinctiveness inside of idiolect. For me, it's about the consistency over time and between utterances and between contexts. But I might have a very similar idiolect to someone who has a very similar social background to me. Distinctiveness comes through in telling me apart from that person would be harder than telling me apart from someone who's very socially different. But that's the idea of an idiolect. Did I do okay, Nicci?
Well, I'm going to give Ray a very simple example. He could be in a bar watching his Philadelphia Eagles win the Super Bowl, and he'd ask for a glass of water, or he can be defending his dissertation, and somehow the concept of H2O would come up, and he would say water. I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up pronouncing H2O as water. The rest of the US, and I think most of the English-speaking world, says water. So it's a regionalism to Philly. So that would be one example, and certainly a spoken example, a spoken language example of idiolect. And there may be people that argue the nuances of that, but that's just one. There's other regionalism, but there's also grammatical features that could kick in there too. And one of the podcasts, the first one, and I think that was the Bentley case. There are arguably some idiolectal features there between whether someone is saying "I then did something" or "then I did something." So it really gets nuanced, and the science behind it is clear in many ways, but it also has to be interpreted in many ways too. So I hope I didn't violate anything there that you already said, Tim.
So, but then I because you talked about the regions, and so in linguistics we talk about the dialects where people come from, and the spoken and written dialects. So that's about a group of people. Anyone who grew up near where you grew up would have that pronunciation. I guess the idea of the idiolect comes down to that intersection of your background. So how many people not only pronounce, I'll say water like you do, water. Okay, what pronunciation do you use? But I can't do accents at all.
Sorry.
But what pronunciation do you use that distinguishes me from you is the distinctiveness piece. Is there a subset of language that's just mine? It's like a dialect, but it's mine. It's only mine. That's my idiolect. Yeah. So am I consistent in myself? So, and the I then I thing in the Timothy Evans case, and we discussed Bentley briefly, but the main focus of that episode is Timothy Evans. It seems in that case and in the Bentley case that I then is a feature of police language at the time, and then I is the lay person, the non-police person is more likely to use than I. And what Jan Svartvik was able to show back in 1968 was that the really contentious part of Timothy Evans' confession, the bits that got him hanged, were written in police language. Yeah, and that was one of his main examples of the police language. So that sort of that case rests on the idea that the confessions were bad confessions because they had been tampered with by the police officers. That inserted the incriminating portions that led to the man being hanged.
A very interesting first podcast. I think it went over into your second podcast too, right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
The Timothy Evans case.
Yeah.
Who's a guy who Ray, and I still want to hear Nicci's case, whether it's that one or not. But this guy, he's accused of killing his wife and daughter. A little complicated, but it also happens he's living in the same house or the same structure with a serial killer.
Yeah.
A separate serial killer. And the first guy was put to death. Nothing's funny about this, of course, but he was hanged. They still had the death penalty in the UK. And years later, I guess, was he pardoned or commuted? But for the wife but not the daughter, or vice versa?
So Evans was hanged in 1950, and then the year after, they discovered this other guy, John Reg, he was known as Christie. Had like 6 women's bodies in and about his apartment, and it was a multi-occupancy house. Really, no, it was very run down. It's not it's a sort of post-war in London, poverty, grim kind of area to live in. Anyway, he'd killed at least 6 other women, and of course that. The chances that Evans's conviction was good was thrown into light by that, and it started up a campaign as to whether Evans was in fact guilty of the murder of his wife and child. And that's the focus of our first 2 podcasts.
We don't want to be giving away too much about that.
Yes.
People need to go and listen to Writing.
Yeah, go listen.
To find out the story.
It's a really, really interesting story.
It is.
It's a terrible story. And historically, it's one of 3 cases that led to the abolition of the death penalty in the UK, because this idea that by the time you've killed someone, if something has gone wrong in the justice process, you can't put it right. Yeah, and Evans certainly was wrongly hanged. And so the linguistic analysis by this linguist Jan Svartvik was published in 1968. And so we pick this story partly because when he published his analysis, it had been used in a public inquiry. He was commissioned to do the analysis for a public inquiry a few years earlier. But when he published it, he subtitled his booklet on this case. He subtitled it "A Case for Forensic Linguistics." And that was the origin of the term forensic linguistics. He was the guy who coined the term back in 1968. So I know your Netflix series, Jim, has basically you inventing forensic linguistics in 2001, 2002, and the rest of it. But we predate you by a few decades.
I had a number of arguments with the director and the writers in that series, and I've corrected that online. But yes, it goes back to a Swede working on a British case who actually is the father of, or actually coined that term.
I'm teasing you, of course. I know you've corrected that on multiple occasions.
That's okay. Nicci, give us the case that you feel you best explains forensic linguistics, or most affected you. Any combination there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the one that sticks with me most is one where which is going to be featured on our podcast on Right and Wrong. So I'm not actually going to give any detail about that, but just to say that this was a case where some murder suspects were covertly recorded in the back of a police van talking to each other in not in standard English, and what the police described it as a code, that they were speaking in code. And actually, when I got to the bottom of it, what it was what we would call a cant. It was a sort of a variety of language that this group of men were using because they had strong suspicions that they were being that someone was eavesdropping on them, basically. Yeah, like I say, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I want listeners to go and check out Right and Wrongs. But that certainly stands out for me as one of the most linguistically interesting cases that I've ever worked on. So the one that I'll tell you about, it's much smaller scale than the example that Tim gave you. And this was actually the first case that I testified about. So the one that I was explaining before, that was also my first experience of hot tubbing. And this was a case where some elderly residents of a housing estate in the north of England had received some blackmail letters. One of these was word processed and one of them was typed on a typewriter. And it was saying things along the lines of, "We've been watching you. We know what you're doing. We know or what you've done. And you need to leave this amount of money in a plastic bag in this particular location. Otherwise, we're going to tell everyone," basically. And so the police had a suspect in mind. And they obtained a warrant to search her property, where they recovered several writings of hers. So there were diary entries, there were letters, there was a sort of little log that she'd been keeping, spying on her neighbours. There were various bits and bobs, and they took her into custody, and they then got her to handwrite. I think there was maybe a slight misunderstanding about what a forensic linguist could offer them, and they decided what they needed was lots of handwriting samples from her. So they asked her to write the same passage, I think 6 or 7 times. So part of the known material that I was provided with was this same statement, sort of several times over. And so my task was to look at the writings that were known to have been authored by this suspect. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear fireworks going off.
Hope it's only fireworks.
It might be an Eid.
Oh, it's Eid, isn't it? The Muslim celebration at the end of Ramadan, and where Nicci lives in Birmingham, there'll be a lot of celebrations around.
Yes, there will. Yeah, it's quite loud. So there was, my task was to look at the known writings and to establish whether there were any potentially idiolectal features that were kind of marked, that were unusual in some way, and there were various odd sort of idiosyncratic spellings of particular words. she seemed to have a habit of compounding words that we would usually produce separately. So, in fact, for example, she would consistently write as one word, in front as well. And she did the opposite. So words that we would usually compound, such as ourselves, she would write as two separate words. So she
If I
had
can
sort of
interrupt you, I had that same situation in a case, and I couldn't think of a word for it. I was still taking classes at Georgetown, and I went to the linguistics professor. I forget what's a word for this. He said, "Let me see. Compound is words together. They take decompound." So I used that in a report. He decompounded these words, and I've used it since then.
Okay.
Continue.
I think I just said split compounds or something like that. But yes. But anyway, this was, and there were lots of these. In fact, all the features I identified in the known writings were also present in the question writings. Right, these two blackmail letters. And the reason I thought this would be a good story, a good case to sort of relay, is what Tim said about not knowing how big a part the linguistic evidence had to actually play in the overall kind of outcome of the case. Because in this case, she was found guilty. I testified, and she was found guilty, but they had found the typewriter that was used to produce the typewritten blackmail letter in her shed, wrapped in bin bags that had only her fingerprints on it. So I'm kind of thinking that was probably a bit more convincing to the jury than me testifying on how this person spells neighbours and the fact that they split compounds and that they compound words that are not usually compounds and so on. So yeah, in that particular case, although obviously my opinion was shown to be the correct one, I had come to the correct conclusion, but how much sway my evidence had really had over the jury in the context of kind of other things like the unique typewriter having not been touched by anyone else, that's obviously questionable.
Yours was the icing on that legal case. I mean, that's one way of looking at it.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, before you report, did you know they found that typewriter?
No, I found out after the case. This is another sort of thing that we've talked about on the podcast, is that we very rarely, we've kind of got our instructions and we produce our report and we'll go to court and we'll speak to that report and be cross-examined on that report, and then we go home again. And it's not very often that we'll actually get any kind of extra detail about the case. Sometimes the person that instructed us will let us know what the verdict was, but beyond that, we don't tend to get any of the other details. So no, I had no idea about the typewriter.
And in fact, we kind of work quite hard to insulate ourselves from those other details, because we know how biasing they can be if you hear.
Well, you have to ensure objectivity whenever you're doing your analysis. And the only way to do that, especially in high stake cases, the only way to do that is to kind of isolate yourselves, just like you said, Tim and Nicci, is so that you don't know what else is going on. But I'm sure if you've ever testified in a case, they've always tried to infer that, oh, well, you must have known about this and you must have known about that. They're always trying to infer to water down your opinion or your analysis.
He said it, water down. Hear him?
Yeah.
He's a Philly guy.
Now, hey, listen, if you really want to hear the Philly thing, it's yo cuz over here. That's the real Philly stuff, right, Jim? You know that.
You were making a very good point and a very good comment.
But just to build up, we had so in another of the episodes that's currently out of the Righting Wrongs podcast, we were aware of this need to isolate ourselves from the rest of the case, and it was another case that I had worked, and I'd worked on the case for 2.5 or 3 years, helping identify an offender. It was a terrorism case, a nail bomb had been set in Edinburgh. And so I was basically part of the police investigation by the time they identified the person, and they wanted a final analysis to be done to take evidence to court. They had this, they'd served a warrant and they'd seized materials from the suspect's house and their computer and so on. And so as to not use all that, I'd helped a little bit, at least. I provided assistance in identifying him. So I wasn't the neutral expert now. And so I brought in a good colleague and friend, Isabel Clark, who's at Lancaster University. And I said, I'm not going to tell you anything about this case. I'm going to just pass you some documents in a certain order. So I passed her the known text first and got her to analyze what was stylistically interesting about the known text, and then passed the queried text. And when we came to do this case came to an end, and the guy pleaded guilty, so we didn't have to go to court. But we came to the end of the case, and a TV show came to make a short episode, a 15-minute segment about our involvement in the case. And Izzy Clark on our podcast, she said, up until the point of the TV show, she didn't know anything about the case. And I'd forgotten to sort of unblind her. I blinded her deliberately so that she wouldn't be biased in producing that final evidential report. But I had forgotten to kind of debrief her at the end of the case and tell her all about what all the ins and outs were. So up until the point of the TV show, she knew nothing. So it would have been impossible for her to become biased in that case. And that's what we're aiming at. I mean, it was a bit extreme, and I guess I didn't do a good job in not debriefing her afterwards. But if you could go into the box, in the witness box, an expert witness, and say, all I've got is the text in front of me, this is what I know, that's a really strong position to be in.
I actually include in my written reports now, and I purposely set it up this way, dealing with lawyers, law enforcement. I said, I don't want to know about your case. Don't tell me anything. And Tim, you and I had some discussions way back in the day when I think I was still in the FBI, and we would get Ray knows they're called ECs, electronic communications, whatever, but they would have a request of me to do a linguistic analysis, and they lay the whole case out on the first few pages. And it helped give me context and what I was looking for, but I don't think I ever called a case wrong. I've never had one kick back on me or overturned anything like that. But I realized to be more sterile and environment, kind of a siloed approach, if you will. At this point on, I'll even sometimes put in my report, or I'm going to put in my report, but I've testified. I'm not sure if the plaintiff or the defendant hired me in this case, if it's a civil matter. And I'm proud to say that. I don't know whose side I'm on here, and I feel very happy with that. And a real quick anecdote is in the Unabomb case, Roger Schei did some very early work looking at the manifesto. This is like in the early summer of 95. I get involved. 96, Kaczynski's identified. And they said, Fitzgerald, you're going to run the comparative analysis project, comparing the Kaczynski writings to the Unabomb writings. I said, don't we want to bring a linguist in? We have this guy Schei. And my bosses said, no, we have a turnaround time. He could bomb again. You know the manifesto better than anyone, which I did, and you're going to run with it. So I think sort of objectively, empirically speaking, it probably would have made more sense to be withdrawn at that point. Now, you know what I did in that case. You've written about it. I came in from a very strange sort of perspective. I wasn't a linguist then. And in this episode, we're not talking about that now. But ironically, I'll just finish with this. A few years later, back to the John Benet Ramsey case, it was getting so political that the people on TV and the experts are saying, oh, law enforcement's working together to frame the parents. They're the ones that killed their kid, all this stuff. They said, of course, they didn't. So I was asked by the Boulder PD to review the Ramsey ransom letter, three pages, mentioned it earlier, and also to compare it to the writings of Patsy Ramsey's and others. And my bosses and I wound up saying, you know what? We think it's better that we sort of outsource this. And let's get someone outside of law enforcement. And Tim, I think you know where this story went.
Yeah.
Don Foster, a nice man, a bright man in Shakespearean literature analysis, was brought in, and he did a great job on Unabomb, sort of backing us up, going up against a well-known linguist of Robin Lakoff, who was hired by the defense. But then Don Foster got involved in the Ramsey case. He had written a letter to the parents a year before saying they didn't kill their kid, and the whole thing got blown up. Yeah. So the case I stayed in that maybe I shouldn't have, Unabomb, worked out fine. The case I got out of that arguably I could have stayed in got blown up. So Tim, but ideally the way you described it, and I heard your explaining that on the podcast, is ideally the way to go. Know as little as you have to know. It's the four corners of the documents, I always say. Yeah. That's all you as a linguist should be looking at.
I think it's really interesting because you have a past as a behavioral advisor with the psychology background. And in that role where you're looking at a case and you maybe want to determine motives or next actions or whatever the tasking is, I think you do want to know absolutely everything. And I think that what's interesting is, because I've sort of grown up in my academic career around forensic psychologists. Jess Woodhams was mentioned earlier. She's a forensic psychologist and expert in case linkage and sexual assault crimes and so on. And I think that as forensic linguistics is a newer discipline, we have partially drawn on the experience of the behavioral advisors. And I sometimes describe my role in investigations as a linguistic advisor sometimes. But there are some things that are different. And if you're a psychologist or a behavioral advisor, then yes, you want to know all the details about the case in order to come to an opinion. But as a linguist, as an expert witness, you've got to draw those dividing lines and say, no, I just want to know what the question is and what the texts are that might or might not answer that question. And so very often now I have this method where I work with another linguist who does the primary analysis. And the police officers can't but help fulfill their training of briefing me about the whole case. It's really hard. You tell them not to, but they will tell you stuff anyway that you wish you hadn't heard.
And not intentionally. They're not, no malevolence involved here. It's just,
no,
it comes
absolutely
out.
Not. But so the person they brief will know everything. And I think there's a lot of power in that person not being the textual analyst, not being the forensic linguist. And I've done this on nearly every case I work now. That separation between what I sometimes call the case manager and the analyst, the linguistic analyst. And I think it's really, really powerful thing to do. It's helpful to the analyst to have that shield, that firewall, and not know anything. And then they know that their opinions are clean. They don't know what side they're working on. And it's just very helpful.
We're going to wrap up here. I have a few closing statements, but Righting Wrongs is an excellent podcast. I'll be listening to more of it on my drive tomorrow. I have. Nicci, a few final words from you, and then Ray, you can final words and I'll take us out. Nicci, anything from you just to wrap up here?
Yeah, just to say that, I think it's I guess there's a lot of people don't really kind of think of language as being a route into sort of casting light on these kinds of issues. I think it's maybe sort of, I think a lot of people have heard of forensic psychology and a lot of people have heard of the various other kind of forensic sciences. And I guess I just want to sort of make sure that we sort of send the message home that that language is important and that it's got that linguistic analysis has a really important role to play in kind of, sort of digging down into sort of lots of different areas of the legal and investigative processes.
Ray, give me a minute here. I just want to, a few things. And I know your first episode and I guess second have to do with police statements and the analysis of those. And I'm familiar with someone who worked a case in the last few years and worked with a prosecutor. So someone working with the police in the US, and they've coined a term through the prosecution community of practice in the US, and that is the false confession industrial complex. So it seems there are many, many experts out there now who they're contacted about a police statement. And now almost all of them in the US, and I think you said in the UK, they're not only audio recorded, they're video recorded, which I think is a good thing. I didn't start my career that way. Ray, I don't think you did either, but I never would have had a problem having my interviews recorded in that regard and played later. But there are some people I think that are sort of taking advantage. Of course, the Miranda warnings in the US, you have to give the legal rights, very similar in the UK, have an attorney, one can be appointed. So they have to kind of dig into the nuances of whether something's verbatim or not verbatim. There have been court decisions in the US that verbatim doesn't mean every and a cough is put in there. And we're not going to open this whole can of worms here, but I'm just saying we have to be careful. And I'm probably the only linguist out there who's ever taken a police statement. And I've taken, hundreds of them over my career, minor cases, major cases. And I probably should have hung that as my shingle early on and joined this industrial complex of a lot of these experts out there getting paid by the courts and different agencies. So I just think we have to be careful there. Any final comments regarding that? I just say urge caution when looking at these statements. 99% of the time, there's no malevolence intended on the part of the police. But, is something copied down that shouldn't have been? In the old days, when we took notes, I always made mistakes on purpose. We were taught this in the academy, Ray, and you give it to the guy to read. Hopefully they can read. I said, no, I didn't say that. Oh, cross that out and initial it, sign the bottom of the page. And that's a pretty, I was going to say clever, but it's a pretty honest way or legalistic way of making sure that the person read the statement that you took from him, even if you, as the FBI agent or officer, wrote it down. So, Ray, any commentary on that part?
No, Jim, I think you made a great point. I think Nicci did, and I think Tim did as well. The field of forensic linguistics continues to evolve, and I'm interested, and I think this is for a large topic, but I wonder what the advancements in AI, and I know, Tim, you're working on some in the Institute on that. What has that done with forensic linguistics? And then you look at it, and it's going into all different types of avenues. It's going into fraud investigations, corporate disputes, cybersecurity. It's entering all these entities, and it's just going to continue to evolve. And you're going to see, I think this is going to be something that's going to be fast growing. I really do. And I want to thank both Nicci and Tim. I really enjoyed, I am fascinated by this stuff. If I was younger, I'd probably take a jump over the pond and study under you guys.
Yeah.
You would be welcome. We run a master's in forensic linguistics, so yes, I would encourage listeners to go and check that out.
And Ray, your co-host, also teaches online forensic linguistics. So.
Yeah, but I want to learn from Nicci and Tim. I've learned enough.
Okay. I don't blame you, quite frankly. And I'm going to end it with this, Tim. I'll never forget. I didn't know you. I may have heard your name. I went to my first linguistic conference in Malta in July of 2001. I don't believe you were there.
I was there. I remember because I think I spoke because there's another American linguist there, Carol Chasky, and Malcolm was in charge of scheduling, and he put me and Carol on the same panel talking on opposing views. Carol had published a paper and I'd published a rebuttal. And there was a fight. But I remember you speaking about the Unabomber investigation there.
Yes, and that's secondary. But Malcolm was very supportive of me then. After giving the Unabomber talk, they gave me an hour. It wasn't even technically the plenary talk, but they gave, because it's such a complicated case. But I'll never forget, I had worked the Van Wyck case. And in the US, that was a precedent-setting case in terms of what I call text analysis evidence being provided. Some restrictions, some limitations. But I was a non-linguist and really the first one in the US, at least federal courts, to get that evidence in. There was a talk given, and you mentioned the name, Carol Chasky, and she told me the day, Agent Fitzgerald, I'm going to be talking about you in my presentation tomorrow. Oh, okay, sure. And I go in, and it was highly critical of what I did and my methodology and my techniques, because I was not a linguist at the time. I didn't start Georgetown yet. And she said, and she presented this whole story, and I remember at the very end with the kind of naive and non-legal audience, she said, and I said, well, he was convicted in court. I raised my hand, and she said, well, everyone, with a pregnant pause, he's appealing. Everyone goes, oh. I said, everyone who gets jail time appeals. There's nothing unusual. Anyway, the case went nowhere. He served all his time in prison. She wrote an article in the Journal of Language and Law, I think it was back then.
Yeah.
Speech, language, and law.
And I was surprised to open it up and read it. And the next article was your rebuttal. I said, wait, how do they do this? But I realized in academia, they give advanced copies out. And without really knowing me, or we met very quickly in Malta, you weren't, kissing my butt or anything like that, but you were saying, hey, my techniques were valid. They worked in this particular case in Van Wyck, and you broke it down, and there was really nothing. And I was always appreciative of having not even met you, And you didn't do it because I was any, special person to you, but you were an objective scientist, linguist, and you had no problem going up against what I thought were some specious sort of arguments on that person's part.
Oh, yes, I just took the text in front of me and I did my analysis, was all we can do.
Which is all a linguist should do. So on that pleasant note, but again, thanks again. And academics can be tough on one another, Ray. You think it's tough in the bullpen sometimes or with other agents and when things go wrong, but academics can really attack each other at the same time. And I kind of came in sort of the back door into linguistics, unlike most other people's path, but I've been accepted by most, and I do appreciate that, even though I'm mostly in retirement now in that regard. Tim Grant, Nicci MacLeod, I want to thank you so much. Everyone, please listen to Writing Wrongs. We just touched on a few things here. Are there any websites either of you want to attach to this or anything else? Please provide it.
There's a website which is, if you search for Aston University Writing Wrongs, it will take you to that website. And we're available on all the usual podcast platforms and so on. And if you find the podcast, that will link to the website as well.
And like it and subscribe and all those type things, which we'll ask everyone here.
That's all the boost we need. Yeah,
that's right. And on that pleasant note, thanks again, folks. Thank you, Ray, for an afternoon session. We don't always do the afternoon, but for our European friends, it works out best. So everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Cold Red. Please like and subscribe us too. Our website is coldredpodcast.com. We're on all the regular sites, as we said. And I want to thank Matt McLaughlin, Matt Robinson, our producers, Rick Schilling, our musical director, and everyone. Keep safe out there. Know your surroundings. Don't let the bad guys get you. And good night, goodbye, and see you guys next time.
And we're out.
Well, I thought I had a nice, solid